The Subcommittee on Health will come to order. Today, the Subcommittee will consider H.R. 847, the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act of 2010, sponsored by Representative Carolyn Maloney, but I also saw Mr. Nadler, who's here, who's also one of the, he is there in the front row, who's also one of the chief sponsors of the legislation. And thank you for being here, Jerry, and all that you do. Now, before we begin opening statements, just a couple of process points, because there's a lot going on today, and members have asked me how we're proceeding, and we have worked out the process as follows between both the Democrats and the Republicans. We will start now, obviously, at 10 a.m. with opening statements, and each member will have 3 minutes to do an opening statement. Once all members, well, I should say that's, I think myself and Mr. Shimkus get 5 minutes, and then the other members get 3. And I think also the other chairmen also have 5 minutes. But other than that, it's 3 minutes. Now, once all members who wish to make opening remarks have had an opportunity to speak, we'll call up the manager's amendment, and they will debate the manager's amendment. But then we're going to take a break for lunch around noon approximately, and we'll come back at 1 p.m. So there'll be no actual votes until after 1 p.m., and then we'll start debating amendments to the manager's amendment. And the understanding is that we'll vote on final passage by the latest at 5:30. So for members, I'm not discouraging anybody from staying. I want everybody to stay and do their opening statements, but I want everyone to understand there'll actually be no votes until after we come back from lunch after 1 p.m.
Would the
yes, I'd yield to my colleague from Illinois.
The only thing I don't know, since Ranking Member Barton's not here, is the 5:30 deadline. I think we'll probably meet that anyway, but I'm not sure there was a time set.
Well, Mr. Barton, yeah, I apologize, Mr. Shimkus. This, I guess, was worked out with Mr. Barton, and I'm assuming.
And I'm not him.
You're not him, I know. All right, well, according to the agreement with Mr. Barton, we were supposed to vote on final passage by the latest of 5:30 p.m., but he's not here, so I know you can't represent what he agreed to, but that's at least the understanding with him. So we'll start now with opening statements, and I'll recognize myself initially for an opening statement. Look, I want to thank, I see that Carolyn came in, and I do want to thank both Carolyn and Jerry for their hard work, commitment, and perseverance on this very important piece of legislation. It's good to see that both of them are actually with us today. I also want to thank all of the first responders who are here today. Honestly, you are the true heroes. There's no question about that. And I also want to thank some of the survivors who are with us here today as well. I know the 9/11 terrorist attacks have changed your lives in many ways that probably most of us could never understand. Since 2008, the subcommittee has held a number of hearings on the health effects of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Specifically, last April, a legislative hearing was held on the bill before us today. These hearings have provided us with vital information on this issue and the need for the bill's passage. More than 8 years ago, our country was struck by a horrible tragedy. Almost 3,000 people were killed in the collapse of the World Trade Center towers in New York City, including hundreds of firefighters, police officers, and employees of companies housed within the towers. Beyond the immediate loss of life, thousands of others are now suffering debilitating illnesses from this aftermath. Every day in the newspapers, just most recently, I think over the weekend, there was another article about heart conditions and how people who were first responders or present on 9/11 have severe heart conditions. So as time goes on, unfortunately, more and more of these illnesses come forward. Now, on 9/11 and the days and weeks that followed, individuals from all over the country rushed to the aid of those in need, not stopping to think about the effects on their health or lives. I remember people from my district who showed up. I remember being on the site shortly after the attacks, within a few days, when President Bush came and many members of Congress, and I saw firsthand the dedication and determination of rescue workers and volunteers who pushed themselves to the brink of exhaustion. These were selfless acts of courage at our nation's time of need. People came from all over. I remember I was telling Carolyn and Jerry that on the day I arrived, there was a big yellow fire truck in front of me from Hialeah, Florida. And I asked the guys, they were all in yellow uniforms, how they had gotten there. And they literally had driven the fire truck after 9/11, took them 24 hours to get up there, and they were there right in front of us with President Bush from Hialeah, Florida. People came from all over the country. Now, we know with great documentation that the dust, glass fragments, and other toxins released into the air affected thousands of responders and survivors. These substances included hundreds of tons of asbestos and nearly 500,000 pounds of lead. This exposure has led to a new or worsened respiratory diseases, gastroesophageal disorders, and other health conditions. And again, I know I sound like a broken record, but Jerry, thank you for, within days you called me. We had a hearing at the federal courthouse, at the federal building, and even though my governor, who was then the EPA commissioner, said, you know, the air's safe, I don't know exactly what she said, so maybe I shouldn't paraphrase, but something to the effect that the air is safe. And, of course, we knew that wasn't the case. And from the very beginning, Jerry, you were there pointing out the impacts on people's respiratory systems. H.R. 847 would establish the World Trade Center Health Program, a permanent program to screen, monitor, and treat eligible responders and survivors who are suffering from World Trade Center-related diseases. It would direct the Department of Health and Human Services to conduct and support research into new conditions that may be related to the attacks and to evaluate different and emerging methods of diagnosis and treatment. Also, the legislation would build upon the expertise of the Centers of Excellence. We have one in my district at Rutgers, and these Centers of Excellence are currently providing high-quality care to thousands of responders and survivors, ensuring ongoing data collection and analysis to evaluate health risks. Over the past 6 months, I've worked on moving this bill through the subcommittee. My staff, alongside the authors of the bill, members of the New York delegation, victims and their families, as well as the advocates that represent them, have continued around the clock to strengthen the bill and ensure its passage. And I just want to thank everyone for their cooperation throughout this long and arduous process. Let me just say one more thing. I know that most of the people impacted are getting care now, the specialized care through these various centers. But I do believe that we need to have a regular program that's authorized and that's signed into law. And I say that for several reasons. First of all, I don't think people should have to come here every year through the appropriations process and continue to agitate for money for this. As they get older, and many of them are sick, they won't be able to do that. So we need a permanent authorization. We need a permanent program. We don't want to have a situation where this continues, even though it's a very good program, on an ad hoc basis, and that's the main reason that we're here today. So thank you all, and I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, our ranking member, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd ask unanimous consent for my entire record be placed into the...
Without objection, so ordered.
So I can just, in essence, summarize, talk to my colleagues, talk to the folks who have joined us today, and first of all, want to thank the folks who answered the sound of the bell and went on site. I, like many members, got on site probably about 5 days after. The telecom subcommittee met at 430 West, the Ameritech building, to look at the communication aspects. Of course, that was right across the street. So we have an appreciation for the immensity of the work that was occurring. And I want to thank my New York colleagues who have been very persistent. And I enjoyed the conversations on the floor as they were whipping the provisions. And I think I was pretty clear to all those who talked to me about how we could move and get a good bipartisan product to move. And this bill is not that product, and we'll offer amendments to try to refine that. First of all, as everyone knows, our national debt is at catastrophic levels. Our number one challenge as a nation is getting control of our fiscal house and getting that in order. The entitlements across the board, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt now consumes every income dollar of taxes we receive. So all our spending that we do in the discretionary amount is all debt driven. It's all us borrowing money from places we'd rather not borrow from, like the Communist Chinese. So our first responsibility as members of Congress is to protect our nation against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Our biggest national threat is our national debt. So how can we address these issues while making sure that we do not increase that? One, and again, this is what I've talked to my colleagues from New York, we have to have a certification process. We have to make sure that those who were working, they are working, or in the surrounding areas. Two, this cannot be an entitlement program. This cannot be an entitlement program. The Veterans Affairs budget is not an entitlement program. The Department of Defense health care budget for our soldiers overseas is not an entitlement program. They are subject to annual appropriations just like almost everything else other than our entitlement program. So if this is, and if we make an entitlement program or a capped entitlement program, we risk not having money once the cap runs out. So if the argument is sound, we should be able to come back every year. Now, what Republicans did last week is we said no more earmarks, period. The amount of money we're going to save from not having earmarks will pay for this and pay for this in years to come because we're not now in the earmarking process, at least in this Congress. So there's another way in which we then can have money through this process. And there's also a recognition of the neighborhood area, the area around the World Trade Center and the people who live there who may have not been first-line responders or construction workers, but are community members in a defined area. They also should have access. And so that's kind of that we've talked, and I've talked with folks from the New York delegation. If we really want a bipartisan bill, let's work, let's craft these changes, let's get a unanimous vote out of this committee. That is the best way for this bill to get through the floor of the House and then have leverage to get it through the Senate. So I look forward to this the debate on the issue and trying to bring some clarity to the proposal and bring it more in line with the needs of those who've come here and also the needs of this nation as far as being fiscally responsible. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time.
I thank the gentleman and yield next for an opening statement to the gentleman from New York. Mr. Engel, I have not thanked, unfortunately, I haven't thanked the members of the New York delegation from our own committee. Both Mr. Engel and Mr. Wiener have played a major role in putting this legislation together and pushing for it, so I want to thank both of you. Mr. Engel?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me thank you for your long-standing support for providing a permanent health care program for the first responders and survivors of the 9/11 terrorist attacks on our nation. This is very, very, very personal to me and to my colleagues. We have so many of them here in the front row, Mr. McMahon, Mr. Towns, Mr. Nadler, Ms. Maloney, Mr. Tonko. They're all here because we're really all in this together. I have and they have friends who died at 9/11, constituents who died in 9/11. I represent Rockland County. We have more policemen and firemen living in that county who perished on 9/11. Dennis Hughes, the head of the AFL-CIO, my constituent from Rockland, is here. We have a whole array of New Yorkers here. This is very, very personal to us. I want to single out Ms. Maloney and Mr. Nadler. This is in Mr. Nadler's district, the World Trade Center. Ms. Maloney has been spearheading this. And this is so important that we not only help the people who selflessly came in and rolled up their sleeves and did what they were supposed to do, but also the people who live in the immediate area through no fault of their own, who were told that everything was safe and everything was fine. The terrorist attacks were an attack on our nation. And New York City and the surrounding area should not be left alone to bear this burden. We've talked so many times about this bill, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all the time that you and your staff has done leading to this day. We're really lucky. New York is lucky to have you as chairman because you always recognize that what happened to the Americans living in New York on 9/11 could have happened to any area of the country, but it happened in New York because New York is the symbol of our country. So let me say, as devastating as that day was, there were few days that I've been more proud to be an American than on 9/11. Within minutes of the crashes into the Twin Towers, New York's first responders mobilized to save those trapped within the World Trade Center, putting themselves in unspeakable danger, and too many lost their lives that day. Within over 40,000 responders from across the nation descended upon Ground Zero to do anything possible to help with the rescue, recovery, and cleanup. We all remember seeing Americans lined up around blocks to donate blood. I remember the chaos as no one quite knew what to do, only that they wanted to do something to help our nation rise up from the assaults by the terrorists. And it's to help our nation. Let me remind my colleagues, not to help New York, to help our nation. These people who went in were helping our nation, and they should be taken care of now, years later. They thought they were safe. And I wonder if we can hold that up, because the federal government told them they were safe. Come into New York and you'll be safe. On September 18th, 1 week after the World Trade Center attacks, September 18th, 2001, the EPA chief, Christy Todd Whitman, said, and I quote her, "Given the scope of the tragedy from last week, I am glad to reassure the people of New York and Washington that their air is safe to breathe and their water is safe to drink." Unquote. What a disgrace for her to make a statement like that. How shameful it is that she made a statement like that. And just 2 days before that, the OSHA Assistant Secretary of Labor, John Henshaw, said, quote, "Our tests show that it is safe for New Yorkers to go back to work in New York's financial district." Unquote. The nerve of them, the gall of them, how shameful of them. And you know what? It wasn't safe at all. And that's why we're here today, to make sure that, God forbid, if we ever have another terrorist attack, that our citizens don't stay home out of fear, and the federal government won't be here for them, as it hasn't been consistently for our 9/11 heroes. The past 8 years, Mr. Chairman, has not been kind to so many of the first responders who put themselves in harm's way. It's estimated that up to 400,000 people in the World Trade Center area on 9/11 were exposed to extremely toxic environmental hazards, including asbestos, particulate matter, and smoke. The illnesses that those exposed to the toxins develop are severe, debilitating, and for many families, simply devastating. The attacks came on Tuesday. Friday, the entire New York delegation was there with President Bush. I'm sure we were all exposed to it as well. But the difference is we didn't go there day after day, week after week, to try to help others. The comprehensive bill before us ensures that everyone exposed to the Ground Zero toxins has a right to be medically monitored, and all that are sick have a right to treatment. It would also rightfully provide compensation for loss by reopening the 9/11 Compensation Fund. Before I close, I just want to comment on the gentleman from Illinois, my good friend, who is my good friend and who is a very, very thoughtful member of Congress. But let me say, please spare us the lectures about deficits. Please spare us the lectures about deficits. Because for 6 years, when the other party was in control of this Congress, with the presidency in both houses of Congress, deficits went higher and higher and higher with red ink as far as the eye can see. So please, let's not balance the budget on the backs of the 9/11 responders. Let's not talk about deficits when we're talking about 9/11 responders. It seems like the federal government always has the money when it needs it. Well, we need it now, and we demand it now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. I see more and more members from New York coming in. We have seats over there in the front, and I do thank so many of you for being here. I see more and more of you coming in. I recognize our ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I give my opening statement, let me comment on what my good friend, Congressman Engel, just said. He knows of my affection for him, and when I was chairman, I helped a number of times on New York-specific issues that were important to him. He and I are co-sponsors of bills in this Congress that have passed this committee. I'd like to point out, in the spirit of facts are facts, this year's deficit's about $1.6 trillion. That's 4 times the largest deficit under President Bush. and President Obama's budget submittal to this Congress never has a deficit less than twice the largest deficit under President Bush. Those are just facts, Mr. Chairman. And we understand the pain and suffering that our citizens and friends in New York City have experienced because of the attack on the World Trade Centers. We understand that. I think this Congress in the last 9 years has done a lot to alleviate the pain and suffering, to show appreciation, to help rebuild. Republicans are not opposed to a well thought out, appropriately sized program to help and to continue to help. This bill before us is a $5 billion new entitlement at a time when we are stretched budgetarily. But even if you put aside the budgetary impact, it's reasonable in an authorization bill to question the size of the program. It's reasonable, Mr. Chairman, to question the scope of the program. At the appropriate time, our new ranking acting member, Mr. Shimkus, is, I believe, going to offer an amendment. If he doesn't, I will, to replace some of the such sums as necessary and actually set a specific authorization level each year. It's my understanding that the Obama administration is requesting $150 million per year. So that's a third of what the bill before us would spend per year. So we can have a debate, Mr. Chairman, on legislation without impugning the motives of the proponents of the legislation or the opponents, or in this case, we're not necessarily opponents as we are wanting to modify it and to streamline it. We did have a legislative hearing last April, and you're to be commended on that. Nobody on our side is saying this isn't something that doesn't have merit. I see the lone Republican from New York out in the audience, so we certainly know that it's an issue that's just as important to the elephants in the New York delegation as it is to the donkeys. And let's hope we'll have a good markup and maybe do something productive today. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Barton. Next is the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your devotion to bringing this forward. Without the chairman, you just don't move. And so I want to thank you for calling this important markup. To all of my colleagues in the New York delegation, thank you. Thank you for your telephone calls. Thank you for your whipping. Thank you for your passion. And everyone that's here in the hearing room, you are blessed to have this delegation representing you. They did it the New York way, I'll tell you. They really put the pedal to the metal, and with great pride. I'm going to have my full statement placed in the record, but I just want to make a few comments. I've heard so far, some of our Republican colleagues commenting on this, and I think for years the rub with our Republican colleagues is the word entitlement, because this legislation is creating an entitlement for those that have been affected. Somehow the word entitlement is kind of a dirty word. It's as if someone is going to step forward and grab something that they don't deserve. The people that will benefit from this legislation have earned it, and they've earned it the hard way. There are people that could not step up to take advantage of the fund that was established, the Victims' Compensation Fund, because they didn't know that they were affected. I don't think any of our citizens should have to come here with a tin cup year after year simply because they were at the heart of September 11th and what they did. As Mr. Engel said, this was an attack on our country. I'm a Californian, but I'm a New Yorker today. I'm an American today. We all are. This is not tens of millions of people, my colleagues. If you think this is going to break the federal government, you've got another thing coming to you. No one here can fix this on their own. That's why they're here. They've brought their case and their illnesses and all that is a part of it. They deserve what they are asking for. As I said, they did it the old-fashioned way. They earned it. So I'm proud to stand not only with the New York delegation, but everyone that pledged on the floor of the House after our country was attacked that we would spare nothing to take care of the families and the survivors. Every member pledged that. There were eloquent speeches that united the entire Congress. Today, there shouldn't be any division on this. So thank you to the delegation. Thank you to the people that have traveled here. You've earned this, and it's a way of all of the people of our country who paid their taxes saying, amen, we're doing the right thing, and we're going to take care of this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all of us look forward to this markup today. And I, along with others, certainly want to thank all those responders to the World Trade Center catastrophe, not only from New York, but those who came from all over the United States to help. And I don't think there's any question here that we all agree that something should be done. But I also believe that we do have the responsibility to ask questions because all of these programs are relatively complicated. And this is an issue that we all can become emotional about because we know that people have suffered real injury, have incurred real illnesses, and it has to be addressed. But I also think we have a responsibility to ask hard questions. And we do have to be concerned about the debt. And I know that to talk about money when people's health is an issue does not seem to be the right thing to do. But when you have a $14 trillion federal debt, I mean, we don't want to end up like Greece. But I do believe that all of us are committed to coming up with a plan that can meet these problems, that can meet the needs of the people who responded. But I think we also need to ask these questions. And some of this, I will say this, that the federal government has already appropriated in excess of $1 billion to help address some of these medical problems, the centers of excellence, the monitoring system, and so forth. But we need to know also, let's say that a responder had private insurance. What will the impact of that be on this program? What if they were on Medicaid? What will the impact be on this program? What if they were veterans and under veterans health care? What would be the impact on this program? What if they were under Medicare? What if the Congress this week passes a national health insurance plan? What will be the impact of that on this plan? And will that be a double expenditure? So those are some of the issues that I think many of us want to look at as we have this markup today and as this legislation moves forward. And I think that our ranking member was correct that if we all work together, and this is one of those issues we should work together on, that we can come up with a solution to address this problem and to address some of the issues that all of us are asking relating to this program. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next is our full committee chairman, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This bill, H.R. 847, is for the tens of thousands of people who survived the initial attacks but who have gotten sick and tragically even died because of their exposures to the toxins released from those downed towers on September 11, 2001. The purpose is to ensure that those people get the health care that they need from providers who are expert in these kinds of illnesses. The people this bill would help include the first responders, such as the firefighters who rushed into the burning towers immediately after they were struck by airplanes, the crews who came to clean up the site and worked without personal protective gear, even though they were inhaling toxins for days on end, the men and women who bravely came back to work in Lower Manhattan in the days immediately following the attacks. This important piece of legislation is a product of years of work by members of the New York congressional delegation, and I would like to thank them for their dedication to this issue. I'd like to also thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Pallone, for your work on moving this bill forward. I strongly support it.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. September 11th, 2001 is a day permanently etched in our nation's memory. Despite the horror and tragedy of that day, we witnessed incredible courage, bravery, and sacrifice, and the first responders and everyday Americans rushed into burning buildings, pulled bodies from the rubble, stayed on site for months to help with the cleanup without a thought for their own well-being or safety. Tragically, since that day, when nearly 3,000 innocent people lost their lives, thousands of those responders and people in the community have been diagnosed with a broad range of diseases and disorders related to their exposure at Ground Zero. And over $1 billion has since been appropriated or awarded for World Trade Center health-related programs. These individuals deserve our gratitude for their sacrifices and health care for their 9/11 related illnesses. And that is why I regret that I have major reservations about this bill before us today. H.R. 847 does not codify current World Trade Center-related health programs. It creates a new mandatory entitlement program at the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Veterans health care is not mandatory spending. Department of Defense health care is not mandatory spending. There's no reason that this program cannot be funded through discretionary spending as well, unless we do not want to force appropriators to find this money every year. After the first 10 years, $700 million a year will be needed to fund the program. Where could the appropriators find that kind of money? Well, last year, Labor H's appropriations bill contained over $772 million in earmarks alone. We could more than pay for the program with that money. I'm also concerned that this program is for World Trade Center responders and community members from New York only. Surely those who heroically responded to the Pentagon when it was attacked are as deserving of health care for their 9/11 related illnesses as their counterparts at Ground Zero. Because we must take care of those sickened by their service that day and in the days and months that followed, I will be supporting a Republican substitute amendment today, and it will authorize a discretionary block grant program for first responders and community members, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you again to the first responders for their bravery and selflessness, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me respond that even though we have a number of New York delegation members, this bill is not for New Yorkers. It's for my first responders who went to New York City to help and may not have had the coverage. So it is for anyone who is there, and that's what's so special about this bill. It's not just designating. Now, granted, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, the closest states, sent most of the first responders, but this bill covers anyone who responded. I want to thank you for holding the hearing today, and my colleague from California said we're all New Yorkers. I think I would really be surprised if y'all, with my Texas accent, said I was a New Yorker. But on 9/11, we all shared the same feelings across our country, no matter if you're in Maine or Hawaii or Texas or anywhere else, about what happened in New York City. And that's why this bill is so important. I've noticed in Congress, the further you get away from a disaster, the less we think about it. Something else comes up, and particularly natural disasters. We have hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico that devastate parts of my district. If we don't do something very quickly, 2 years later, we have other disasters. The 9/11 was not a natural disaster, so Congress needs to continue to focus on this. And that's why this bill is so important, to make sure that those folks who showed up there, just for doing what they wanted to do to help, will be taken care of because of what they were exposed to. Mr. Chairman, I have a full statement I'd like to place in the record, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and hopefully we'll pass this bill when we get through. Thank you.
Without objection, so ordered. All member statements will be, full statements will be entered into the record. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Murphy.
Mr. Chairman, my brother was a ladderman for Engine Company 17 in New York City, the South Bronx. He had unfortunately been injured when his ladder collapsed under him, and he was forced to leave the department because of his injuries. Over a number of years of recovery, he recuperated, but couldn't go back to be a New York City fireman. But on September 11th, as he sat home in Hudson, Ohio, and watching television, he told me that as soon as he saw the planes crash in the World Trade Center and saw what happened, he needed to get back to New York City. So he got back. He did what so many other first responders did around the country. I remember that evening as I was driving back to Pittsburgh in my district myself. Coming from the east, I saw so many fire trucks, their lights aglow on the Pennsylvania Turnpike headed to New York City. They weren't asked to be there, but they came. My brother tells me of the outcomes of so many other of his fellow firemen from Ladder Company 17 and so many others who were there with heart problems and pulmonary problems. A recent study funded by the Fraternal Order of Police talking about the heart problems that so many policemen have. And so it goes on. From my district, Andrew Walker, who runs Nicholson Construction Company, got a call from, I believe, the engineers who designed the bathtub that the World Trade Center was built in, so called because it was large retaining walls that kept the Hudson River out from there. They said that the walls showed signs of weakening, and if it did collapse, the Hudson River would pour into the site. So for 15 months, 100 Nicholson Construction employees worked to secure the large retaining wall in the lower Manhattan ground. They did so, and they helped protect the many workers who continue to be there. Like so many other World Trade Center contractors, they are rightfully concerned about the future problems of what's going to happen with their compensation claims and what they could do for their health. I want those workers to know. I want the first responders here to know, and I want America to know that my brother was one of you, is one of you. He is a reverse responder like so many of you. We did not choose to have New York City as the site of this terrorist attack, but so it is. But all of you chose to be there and to answer the call, even if not asked, for days, for weeks, for months. And Congress has a choice as well. One New York City first responder is my brother. Because of that, all New York City first responders are my brothers and my sisters. All of those who came that day to clean up, lend a hand, and in some cases give your lives, you are my brothers and my sisters. You have a brother in Congress who thanks you, who is grateful to you for all you have done and continue to do, what you sacrifice, what you continue to give, and I will be here today to vote to give you that support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Next is the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit my opening statement for the record, but I just want to add my thanks to all of the first responders who are here with us today and who might be watching these proceedings on television. Like Mr. Murphy, I also, even though I'm from Colorado, I have a relative who was directly responding to the terrible tragedies on September 11th. My brother-in-law lives in suburban New York, and he's a volunteer at a local ambulance corps. And when the Twin Towers fell, he and his colleagues at the ambulance corps immediately ran down, jumped in their ambulance, and without being asked and without even thinking twice, they got in their ambulance and drove down to Ground Zero and ministered to the people who were there, just like all of you did. And so for us as a nation to say this is only a problem of New York, this is only a problem of those first responders, that's not true. Every American who had had the ability and the wherewithal to go down there and help folks down there would have done that, because that's what we do as Americans. Just as we help the families of those returning from defending our country at war, we need to help the first responders and their families who, without question, without a second thought, just like my brother-in-law, went down, rushed down to help people, because that's the true American spirit. That's what we do. And frankly, this Congress needs to act as the representative of all Americans to show the deep gratitude and concern that we share for the first responders. And we need to put that gratitude into action to make sure that the health care costs are covered and all of the other things that are so necessary in this legislation, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for marking up this bill today, and I will commit to helping you pass it through the House and through the entire Congress.
Thank you. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join my colleagues on the dais in welcoming the New York delegation to the committee. Also acknowledge a former member of the committee, former member of the New York delegation, Vito Fossella, who was instrumental in a previous Congress in helping me understand the breadth and the scope of the illnesses that were incurred as a result of the conditions surrounding Ground Zero. The troubling thing to me is we're here 9 years later, and I do believe we have an obligation to those who responded to the World Trade Center, attacks that were so astonishing in their cruelty that we all pray they're never repeated. I'm a co-sponsor of the legislation, and I did that to show I was committed to those who've suffered because of those attacks. And Mr. Chairman, my staff has worked with your staff to identify problems that some of us on this side have with certain elements of the bill. Those are of concern to many of us, and I guess the real frustration here is, okay, we have hearings and we have markups and we have nice speeches, but we don't ever get a bill to the floor. We don't ever get a bill that we could get passed on the floor, and boy, that really should be our goal with this legislation, at least in my opinion. We have some potential remedies. We have some points of disagreement. We have some points of agreement. The manager's amendment, which many of us did not get to see until yesterday, does touch on some of the issues that have been identified. But, you know, I got to say, those solutions were not drafted in consultation with members of the minority. They were just sort of delivered to us. But it does contain, the manager's amendment does contain some new ideas, perhaps some good ideas. People are concerned about entitlements. There's a cap on the entitlement. Okay, that's a springboard for discussion. We could talk about that. But we moved to this markup before we really had a chance to negotiate and fully vet some of these new concepts. And just for the record, negotiations typically involve a dialogue and not a monologue. But unfortunately, that's what we've been getting. Now, I hope we can move forward and work with the members of the majority and any others who wish to improve this bill. I don't yet think that it's perfect. I would like to see us get it into something that could move to the floor. And you've heard people on both sides talk about how great it would be if we would have a bill that would move to the floor unanimously. But, Mr. Chairman, I would just say listen to the concerns on this side of the dais. Make sure that our scope is proper to our righteous goal. To allow an unwillingness to amend the underlying legislation to stop its movement towards the law really only compounds the tragedy. So I think it would be a welcome commemoration and recognition of the sacrifice to those who responded to the worst terrorist attack to ever take place within the United States to move this bill forward in a manner that will assure broad support. And I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Next is the Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Dingell.
Chairman, I have an excellent opening statement which I ask unanimous consent be inserted in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
My time.
Oh, the chairman yield back. Thank you. Next is a gentlewoman from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to appreciate your long-standing commitment to this issue and for holding a markup today. I am pleased to have the committee finally taking action on this matter, and also privileged to serve on the Judiciary Committee, which last year advanced the section of the bill over which it has jurisdiction. The events of 9/11 are with all of us every day, but the individuals that we are seeking to help through this legislation bear a far worse burden. Through no fault of their own, simply by being at work or as the result of their bravery and patriotism, thousands of individuals suffer devastating health conditions. Scientific experts have assessed that the massive combustion of jet fuel, cement dust, and many other toxins, including asbestos and other contaminants, have caused severe respiratory problems that may be lifelong. Hospitals and healthcare providers in New York and around the country are attempting to care for these complicated and difficult chronic conditions, but they need our help. The terrorist attacks happened in New York City, but the effects know no geographic bounds. Hundreds of Wisconsinites responded to the need for cleanup crews and disaster workers, and these Wisconsinites too struggle with the after effects these 9 years later. For them and for the thousands more who suffer with them, I am pleased to strongly support the bill before us today. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back my remaining time.
Thank you. Gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to put my full statement in the record and just make a few comments. I really want to thank my colleagues from New York for the tremendous and consistent work that they've done for all these years to this legislation, and I want to add my voice to thanking the first responders, the volunteers, the survivors that are here today to pass this this legislation. This is seared in all of our consciousness, and also from Illinois, my home state. We supported the relief efforts at Ground Zero. People risked their lives to save the lives of others, and like many, did it without the necessary respiratory equipment. The EPA told them that the air was safe to breathe. It's no big surprise that these responders and survivors now have serious physical and mental health maladies as a result of that day. What is a surprise, and what will add insult to injury, is if this country does not provide for the needs of the victims. There is no excuse any longer for that. Many of the people directly impacted by the dust and debris from that day have become too sick to work. Some have died. PTSD, depression, anxiety have also limited survivors' ability to maintain employment. And as too often the case, no job means no health insurance. Hopefully we'll deal with that. So this bill, the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act, is finally the answer. We can't wait another day, and I look forward to passage of this legislation. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Next is our other member from New York who's been out front on this every day as well, Mr. Wiener.
Thank you, Mr. Maloney.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my colleagues from New York who have made this a reality. You know, I have every confidence that my Republican friends are going to be helpful in making this a bipartisan effort. I know that because each and every one of them was extraordinarily supportive and understanding and patriotic after September 11th. We passed legislation at that time that provided an open-ended compensation fund for those that were victims of that horrible attack. We didn't flinch to provide funds for those that whose families had died that day. And today what we're doing, frankly, is helping people who are still dying from September 11th. The tragic truth is that in this audience, and people represented here and people watching at home, sitting on their couch, are dying from the attacks of September 11th. That's the facts. And when we face moments like this, like we did after September 11th, partisanship melts away, and we realize that when the men and women were lining up, pulling steel out of the pit at Ground Zero, looking for their brothers and sisters and friends and even strangers, nobody asked them what their party was. Nobody asked them for an insurance card. No one asked them for identification. We were faced with a uniquely unifying American day, and we responded that way. And when I returned here to Washington, people like Mr. Shimkus and Mr. Barton were not from Illinois, not from Texas, not from New York. We were Americans that day. And when the Daily News reports that Reverend Stephen Petrovich from Huron, Ohio, a priest who came to New York and day by day was administering last rites, you can imagine how that must sear a person's soul. Well, now it's more than his soul that's seared. Now he is practically out of house and home. He has sold everything he says but the chalice his grandmother got him when he was ordained as a priest. And in yesterday's Daily News, it's reported that he's raising money among strangers on Facebook to try to pay for his health care. He's not from New York. He's not a firefighter. He's not famous except for this small story that Michael McCullough of the Daily News did. But he represents the silent troubles that people are facing all over this country. He doesn't know what an appropriation is or what an authorization is or a subcommittee is. He knows that on that day, on September 11th and the days after, we made a contract that we were going to take care of people who took care of this country at that moment of need. That was a contract. We made that contract, and we did it in a bipartisan way as Americans. You want to call it a subsidy? Do you want to call it a benefit? Do you want to call it an appropriation? Do you want to call it an entitlement? It's not going to make Reverend Petrovich healthy, but it might do what we can to ease this slow death that is caused by September 11th. My colleagues, I want to tell you there's probably no more partisan person in this House. I wear that like a badge of honor in many cases. And Mr. Shimkus knows it. But I have to tell you that I believe that at the end of this long day of legislating, we're going to be proud to stand together again to do the right thing. And we're not going to do the right thing for New York. We're not going to do the right thing for people who have insurance or don't. We're going to do the right thing because that's who we are as Americans. And I got to tell you, I've never been more proud to be a member of this Congress than when I came back after that dreadful day and found so many of my colleagues with whom I disagree on so many things coming up to all of us from New York and saying, you know what, we're all Americans now, we're all New Yorkers now. All of my colleagues voted for a program exactly like this one in the days after September 11th. And if we knew then what we knew now, we would not even be having this discussion. We would have put one sentence in. Not only those who were died and those who were harmed, but those who are going to for time immemorial. And this is not an open-ended appropriation, an open-ended subsidy. It's not an open-ended entitlement. Because unfortunately, the people that are down on that pile, who live in that neighborhood, and who are all around in virtually all 435 districts, are dying today because they were heroic volunteers on behalf of fellow Americans. And we, the bipartisan representatives of those people, are going to stand up for them today, all these years later, and do the right thing. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for leading us in that effort.
Thank you, Mr. Weiner. Mr. Gonzalez, the gentleman from Texas, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I never make opening statements, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to be very brief. But for those members that weren't here that day, I want to tell you what we did as members of Congress. It was total chaos here in Washington, D.C. Communication systems didn't exist. We corrected that since then. But we all met over at the Capitol Police Headquarters. Everybody remember that day? Republicans and Democrats. And we were asking, I guess, police chief and security people, we want to go back to the Capitol. We want to be on the floor. That's where we belong. That's where we will reach people. That's where we will communicate with our constituents. We understood New York was the target, but we understood fully that it was the entire country that had come under attack. We were instructed that we were not to return to the Capitol, that we would not be allowed to come back on the floor. Do you remember what we did? We all gathered up, Republicans and Democrats, throughout the country, representing diverse populations and constituencies. We all marched to the Capitol. Do you remember that day? And we were all on the steps. Do you remember that? And we sang the praises of this country. We recognized the huge tragedy in the attack, but we came together. When we vote on these amendments today, when we vote on this bill, I would ask my colleagues to go back to that time and just for a second pretend that this bill was being presented to us as we stood there on the Capitol steps. How would you vote then? Is how you should vote now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like everyone here today, I believe the federal government has a commitment to support the brave responders and survivors of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I do wish that the majority had worked with us a little earlier on. I think there was a way that we could have made this a fiscally responsible bill by making it subject to annual appropriations. That's something I probably can get over given the looming, what I think, issue of treating these first responders like the heroes that they are. But I would hope in the future that maybe we could work a little stronger together to make sure that when we take care of them, we don't do it at the expense of other Americans. And when you don't make this the subject of annual appropriations, you put at risk funding for other things. And I think that's something we all have to be very, very, very sensitive to as we move forward. But just for the sheer courage and bravery and I think symbolism of what they accomplished on 9/11, we have to support this measure and make sure that their health and welfare and well-being is taken care of. And I would yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Barrow.
I thank the chairman. I can add nothing of comprehensiveness to what's been said already, or of eloquence to what's been said by my friend from Texas. I'm here to support this legislation, and just as importantly, I'm here to vote against any amendments that would weaken its purpose or effect. And so, in the interest of time, I'll waive any further opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Barrow. Gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Mrs. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this markup. I want to also add my word of welcome to the New York delegation who are here with us, and to the first responders and any families that may be here, especially those who may have lost someone at 9/11. We in the Virgin Islands also responded and supplemented the workers there, and we were honored to host some of the brave men and women who spent so many days and nights working so hard at Ground Zero with a respite from the stress and the hard work, a few days of sun and sea in the Virgin Islands, and we were honored to have you. The first responders and the volunteers who dropped everything and rushed to try to save the people in the World Trade Center and then to recover those who we lost and later to clean up and remove the last vestiges of that day of infamy, did not think about their own safety or security or the possible repercussions. They were only thinking about helping. What H.R. 847 does is provide them and those who lived and studied in the area with security, an entitlement that ensures that they will receive the examinations, the monitoring, and the treatment they need for as long as they need it. Although this is a major step forward, it is nothing compared to the debt that we owe them, all of them, because the terrorists did not care if there were people from other countries in the building or if they came here with documentation or not. And all who came to help were welcomed, no paperwork required. So I'm a proud co-sponsor of this bill and look forward to voting to pass it and to bring health care to those who gave their all for the people in the World Trade Center and by extension, all of us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Next is the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Castor.
Chairman Pallone, thank you very much for holding this markup today. And I'd also like to salute the members of the New York delegation for your tenacity. You are true representatives of the dedicated New York families and first responders. After September 11th, Americans from all backgrounds and regions came together in a way that most of us have never seen in our lifetimes. We stood together for the families of lost loved ones and for the first responders that sacrificed their lives to pull victims from the rubble of the fallen towers. There are more than 700 9/11 first responders living in Florida now, my home state, and more than 1,200 Floridians registered in the World Trade Center Health Registry. About a year ago, my hometown newspaper, the Tampa Tribune, reported that Ivan Castrillo, a New York City police officer now living in my hometown of Tampa, finally discovered the cause of severe respiratory problems that he's had since 2001. He arrived on the World Trade Center grounds at 11 a.m. after the attacks and spent 6 months following the attacks, standing guard during recovery and cleanup. I went home on a daily basis covered in soot, said Castrillo, then a 16-year veteran of the New York Police Department. My wife couldn't believe the smells I was bringing home. What followed was shortness of breath, acid reflux, and chest pain. Those symptoms came on after he retired and moved to Florida, to Town and Country with his wife Evelyn, which is just outside of Tampa. It took 8 years for doctors to put his symptoms together and conclude that his suffering was the result of exposure to the concrete, jet fuel, asbestos, and lead that he breathed in the days after the attacks. For years, he's had difficulty working because after only a few hours, he'd find himself with unbearable chest pain, and he was in and out of the emergency room. Finally, Ivan is registered in the database of first responders. He will now have access to treatment for his exposure and coverage for his conditions, which developed as a result of the attacks. Since 9/11, several programs have assumed responsibility for treating first responders and others with direct health problems associated from the air exposure in the days following the attacks. However, nearly a decade later, it's long overdue that Congress acts to create a permanent program that will help first responders now living all across the country, help them deal with and treat the unique conditions that developed after their hours on Ground Zero. Again, thank you, Chairman Pallone, and I look forward to moving this legislation through the committee and to final passage. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Boyer. Passes. Gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Braley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. I grew up in Brooklyn, Iowa, small town of 1,400 people. And when you had a problem in Brooklyn, Iowa, nobody asked you if you were a Republican or a Democrat. They asked for your help, and they got it. I had good friends back in Iowa who had siblings working at Cantor Fitzgerald who lost their lives. The stories in the Des Moines Register were full of people from Iowa who were impacted by the tragedy on 9/11.
And that is why it is so important that today we send a clear message about what the soul of this country is all about. It's about taking care of each other in our time of need. I went to a small county fairgrounds in a small community called Maquoketa in my district, where firefighters from about a 75-mile radius around that community came and were fed by the residents of Maquoketa. And they were there that day because when a fire broke out that consumed nearly an entire city block in that small town, first responders and firefighters came from all over the area to help try to put it out. And just the importance of showing appreciation was what brought all those people together that night. And it was an enormous showing of the sense of community that brings us all together, not just as people from a given location or one state, but what makes us uniquely American. And that's why I'm proud to support this legislation, and I will be opposing any attempt to amend it. And I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Briley. I know I can't, when you mentioned Cantor Fitzgerald, it just brought back memories to me because so many of my constituents in the Middletown area were from Cantor Fitzgerald and passed away on 9/11, so I appreciate your mentioning that. We're going to now call up the bill.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I'm just wondering, since some of our colleagues have come in since we started, I just want to acknowledge that Mr. King is here, Ms. Velasquez is here, and Mr. Ackerman was here. And I would like to also acknowledge Steve Cassidy, who's head of the Firefighters Union of New York, is also graces us with his presence. Thank you.
Thank you. And as I said, I do appreciate not only the presence of our colleagues from New York, but also all the work that they did on this legislation. It truly was an amazing effort, and it was also bipartisan. We have Mr. King with us here today. Thank you. The chair now calls up H.R. 847. The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 847, a bill to amend the Public Health Service Act to extend and improve protections and services to individuals directly impacted by the terrorist attack in New York City on September 11, 2001, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. And we'll now move to the manager's amendment. I'll recognize myself to offer a manager's amendment to H.R. 847 in the form of an amendment in the nature of a substitute. And as the manager's amendment is passed, I would ask the clerk to report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 847 offered by Mr. Pallone. Strike out all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Without
objection, the manager's amendment will be considered as read. And I'll recognize myself for a statement on the manager's amendment. This amendment makes a few overarching structural changes to the underlying bill. First and foremost, the amendment changes the open-ended entitlement structure and instead puts forth a capped mandatory spending program. It does so by establishing a fund called the WTC Fund that would pay for all activities under the bill. Both the federal government and New York City will contribute to this fund. In the first 10 years, there will be a total of $5.1 billion in the fund, of which New York City will pay 10%. In 2021, the federal government will deposit $700 million into the fund, and New York City again will contribute 10%. For every year after that, those amounts for the federal government and for the city will be adjusted for inflation, and these numbers are based on a previous CBO score of the underlying bill. Because we moved to a capped mandatory spending structure, this amendment also adds a requirement that the WTC administrator report to Congress when 80% of those funds have been expended. This will allow Congress to take action if it feels that the fund would require additional monies to be deposited. The amendment renames the community program and refers to it instead as the Survivors Program. This is to better reflect the individuals who are being served. The Survivors Program serves individuals who ran for their lives after the planes hit, people who grabbed hold of co-workers' hands and pulled them to safety, people who were the victims of the first attack of the war on terror. They too are heroes of that atrocious event, and it is crucially important to ensure that they continue receiving treatment for the resulting illnesses that they now suffer. Let me just say, and I'm adding this to my statement, you know, I was talking to our ranking member that 9/11 was a Tuesday, like today. I was thinking about it because we had morning hour at 10:30 this morning when we make 5-minute speeches. And I was actually on the floor that morning waiting to do morning hour when the attack occurred. And as Mr. Gonzalez and others mentioned, my first, or at least we were under the impression at the time that the Capitol was going to be attacked. And when we heard that the Pentagon was attacked and we heard about the plane that went down in Pennsylvania and all the heroes on that plane who made the plane go down as opposed to attacking another building, many of us to this day believe that that plane was headed towards the United States Capitol and that we, the members of Congress, were actually the ones that were supposed to be attacked and the victims. So I just mentioned that this is not only an attack against the United States, but I think it probably was an attack against this building and this United States Congress as well. We'll never know, I suppose. The amendment strikes the listing of the centers of excellence by name and replaces that language with criteria by which a given health care center can become a center of excellence. We know that individuals from around the nation came to New York City in the immediate aftermath of the terrorist attacks. We actually have the numbers by congressional district for anyone who's interested. This new language will streamline the process for a center to open in other regions of the country beyond just the tri-state area in order to better serve all of our nation's heroes, regardless of where they currently reside. The amendment combines the data collection provisions and the underlying bill into one provision and clarifies that all data collection and analysis must be done in a uniform manner. This will facilitate research into the various health conditions that are afflicting our heroes, which in turn will provide more information about the diseases, the disease progression, and the most effective treatment protocols. The amendment also clarifies that this data will be available to all health researchers, not just those employed by a center of excellence, in order to encourage more research to be done on the data. And it specifies exactly which provisions of HIPAA and other privacy protections will apply so that we ensure patient confidentiality. And finally, the amendment makes additional smaller technical changes, all aimed at streamlining processes and allowing this program to best serve our nation's heroes. I'd like to thank everyone again who worked to strengthen the language. I support this amendment. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to do the same. Now, I'd like to ask if any member would like to seek recognition to speak on the manager's amendment. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers.
I just have a question for the chair. Is the 10% that the city would contribute, is that cap at $500 million mean once they hit that $500 million through any form of payout, it stops? Could be year 2, could be year 3.
Yes, the answer is yes. I mean, I guess the 10% of the 501 is the 51. So the answer is yes.
So that stops. So then would the federal government be responsible for making up the difference if they hit that number early?
Well, the way this is set up in the manager's amendment as a cap. So even though it is an entitlement, it's actually capped at that amount, and that's it.
Except for every year you add an amount based on inflation up to the certain amount. Is
what I gave you was the cap for the 10 years. After that, there's a certain amount for each additional year after that, but again capped, and with the 10% from contribution from the city. So it's always capped. Now we can go back and adjust. It'll be adjusted for inflation after the first 10 years, but it's always a cap.
Unless they hit that $500 million, then it's, no matter what year it is, if they've already hit the $500 million, they contribute 0. Is that right?
My understanding is that the amount of federal dollars as well as the 10% that New York contributes is capped. In other words, it's only going to be 10% of that total.
Right. Okay. I'm just trying to get that clarified. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, if the council wanted to add anything, no? Okay. Any other members? As I said before, once we're done with this debate, we're going to break and then come back at 1 to start with amendments. So we have plenty of time if anybody
Mr.
wants
Chairman,
to. Yes.
I think the agreement is, since we gave the ranking member the opinion that he would be able to come back and talk on the manager's amendment, that once we come back, there can still be more discussions on the management before we go to individual amendments.
I have no problem with that, but I would urge people, if they have questions, to offer them now because we have time. But no, there's no problem when we come back if somebody wants to ask additional questions.
And Mr. Chairman, can I be recognized for?
Yeah, recognize the gentleman.
And I just want to follow up on Mr. Rogers' comments. Part of the manager's amendment says, of course, this is the issue, that there's cap, but then there'll be a report back to the administrator if 80% of the cap is near reach, so that the impression will then be then the fund then goes back to us so that we can authorize more money over the cap, which speaks to the whole argument of why have a cap, issue 1. Issue 2.
If the gentleman would yield, and I'm not, I mean, but I just want to, I think you said it, but I want to clarify that Congress would have to take action if you were going to go over the cap. I mean, obviously, any Congress can always change it and add more money, but that would require congressional action.
Right, and that's kind of our debate about doing annual appropriations. So it's in essence the same thing, only we're doing it every year. You would do it if the cap gets broken. But let me ask, if we bust the cap, will there still be a 10% requirement from New York to fund in addition to once you bust the cap?
Well, I think, again, since, I'll ask counsel, but my understanding is since if it would take congressional action to go above the cap, then that new bill would determine, what percent New York pays, because our bill doesn't assume that we're going above the cap. That it would take an additional congressional action, and then that legislation would have to specify the amount, if the council would like to.
Mr. Chairman, under the bill, there is established a fund, World Trade Center Health Fund, and Health Program Fund. Into that fund is deposited a total of $5.1 billion over 10 years. Of that amount, 90% is federal dollars. So there are two caps right there. In addition, 10% of that amount is New York City's obligation, up to $510 million over the 10-year period. Okay, that's the specification in the legislation before you. If circumstances change and the Congress wants to revisit that, that would have to be done by legislative action. There's no way in the legislation that those limits can be breached. In response to Mr. Rogers' earlier question, the liability of the federal government under the bill as in the manager's amendment is capped at 90% of the $5.1 billion. So that would be $4.59 billion over the 10-year period for all the costs of the bill. And again, there's no way under the legislation that cap can be breached. Congress would have to return to it and readjust those limits.
And I mean, again, I know I'm saying the same thing, but I think bottom line is that Congress would have to take an additional action to spend more money beyond the cap, and then you could take the precedent of the 10%, but there's nothing that specifies what happens if we decide to add additional money, because it's not envisioned that that's done unless the report finds that it's necessary, and then we decide to do it.
Mr. Chairman?
Question to counsel. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Would the gentleman?
It's the time of Mr. Shimkus.
I'd just like to follow up with counsel. So it's correct that under this proposal, the only federal funds available for this program for 10 years would be that $4.6 billion, which you just quoted, amount. Is that correct?
Over the first 10 years, yes.
Correct. So if the program spends $4.6 billion in 3 years, does that mean there will be no federal funds going to this program for 4 years through 10?
That's correct, unless the Congress returns to it.
Okay. Thank you.
Gentleman from New York, strike the last word.
Yes,
Recognized for
strike
5 minutes.
The last word. I just wanted to reiterate what the council just said, so that everybody understands it. There is a cap on the program of $5.1 billion. New York has to pay 10% of that, and so it's actually $4.6 billion that the government, the federal government, would pay. It's not open-ended. We'd have to come back to Congress in order for it to be raised. It's clearly capped at $5.1 billion, with New York paying 10% of it. I yield back.
And I mean, again, you know, I want to stress, I know no one's asking, but I'll volunteer, that, you know, this is based on CBO estimates of the underlying bill and how many people need to be served. So, I mean, obviously we didn't make the numbers up. I mean, this is what we estimate is necessary based on the numbers of people that are out there that have been served or would need to be served. All right, I don't want to prolong it if no one else has any questions. I know, the gentleman from Indiana.
My question is that you want this to be under the mandatory funding side of the budget?
Yes.
So you're going to place these individuals in a different position than what we do for our own veterans.
Well, my response to that, because I know the gentleman chairs the committee, is that, you know, I, over the years, have been an advocate for mandatory or entitlement status for the veterans as well. So I would do both, actually, but I know that's not before us. That's before your committee.
Well, we're establishing policy, and policy for a country. So you want to say that the individuals at 9/11 should be treated differently than right now how we treat veterans in our country.
Correct, but only because we don't treat the veterans the way we should. And again, I'm not trying to disparage you in any way.
If we pass this, we end up with an inequity. If you pass this, we have an inequity when it comes to the funding side of the budgets. So how you envision the world doesn't define how it will be if this bill passes. If you pass this bill, then we end up with an inequity whereby the mandatory side of the budget treats individuals differently than with regard to health care on how we treat combat disabled veterans. That's a fact. So I just wanted to make sure that that's what you wanted to do from a policy standpoint. See, I disagree with what you want to do, but if that's what you want to do, I just wanted to make sure.
Would the gentleman yield on that point? I think we can all stipulate to the idea that this is an unusual circumstance and an unusual population. And I think that you're right. This is an unusual construct, too. It's not a true entitlement because it's capped. It's not a true entitlement because you had to live in a certain geographic area. You had to have come to ground zero. It is an unusual thing. It would be akin to special provisions we might have made to the residents of Hawaii after Pearl Harbor. So I think we have to be careful. I think that you're right. I mean, it's clear that you're right, and we're going to have this instance come up a lot during this markup, that people are going to say, wow, you're doing kind of an unusual thing here. We are, because I'll be honest with you, prior to September 11th, the morning of September 11th, we hadn't really had an instance like this. So what did we do? We created an unprecedented victims' compensation fund that had open-ended by dollar amounts but closed-ended by time amounts. So the gentleman is exactly right, and I think that whether or not we should have a conversation about other elements of the budget that maybe we want to fund in a similar way, but the gentleman is right. There is no doubt that this is an extraordinary group of Americans at an extraordinary time, but we've already, as a Congress, stipulated to that with other legislation.
Reclaiming my time, this is not a debate as to whether this group should be recognized and funded. This is about what side of the budget is this going to be done. And likewise, the American soldier, Marine, Air Force sailor, whomever they find themselves in a combat situation, is also a very select group. So I mean, if we wanted to talk about authorizing an existing program, authorizing a program that has been created really through the appropriations process, and do it on the discretionary side of the budget, I think this hearing could be done pretty quick. Mr. Weiner, I appreciate your comments, and I think we recognize we're about to put define this very awkwardly is my point, and I'm really unsettled. I'm unsettled because you're right. I've invested 18 years in safeguarding and providing the funding through the VA and taking care of those who've done so much for us. And creating inequities makes me really uncomfortable.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. This is not a matter of pitting the 9/11 first responders against veterans. The gentleman is right. Veterans right now, wounded combat veterans, are not entitled to a mandatory entitlement. I think they should be. And I would be happy to sponsor legislation with the gentleman to make that happen. But I don't think it's fair to say that because right now veterans do not have this mandatory entitlement, the 9/11 responders shouldn't either. I think it's quite the opposite. We should pass this bill, give it to the 9/11 responders, and then we should pass a bill giving the mandatory entitlements to combat veterans, all veterans. Certainly.
We're facing a reality.
The gentleman's time has expired, but I ask
gracious.
unanimous consent to give the gentleman another 2 minutes.
Thanks. This is a really good discussion to have because budgetary-wise, the mandatory side of our budget is eating up the discretionary side of the accounts. That is in fact a reality. And if the real issue is that you want to place this on the mandatory side of the accounts because you don't want to come back year after year, that's what we do. It's part of the appropriations process. It's part of the oversight process. And it is part of the functionality of Congress. So just justify by saying, well, just put it on the mandatory side so you don't have to come back year after year, I don't think passes any test. That's just my sensing on it. And it is, when I look back at these 18 years now of having done this year after year after year, sure there have been debates, but we even went through the debate on the mandatory funding side, on the health care piece on veterans, and the decision was made to do advanced funding. And that's what you all voted on. And we kept it in the discretionary side. And when you keep it in the discretionary side, you know what it does? It forces all of us to put our eyes. Put your ranger eyes on it, Colonel Shimkus, and that's what's important. If you do it just on the mandatory side, then you don't put as much oversight as really what I think we need. And that would be my comment to the gentleman. I appreciate the gentleman's comments, though. I yield back.
Gentleman has yielded back. Again,
Chairman, strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I just want to follow up with my colleague, and it's not just the VA. It's active duty soldiers' health care benefits are also discretionary, and that's part. And my opening statement was we could pass this. We could move this bill with 100% bipartisan vote if we would put our eyes on the prize, meeting the needs of those who need benefits, and annually appropriate, authorize, and move. And we could do this, and that's what we've offered, and we'll have some amendments to try to do that. I want to go back to this $4.6 billion federal requirement, and my question was, if the funds get run out in 3 years, what happens then?
Would counsel want to respond?
Well, the Congress would have to revisit the issue.
Well, on pages 40 and 41 of the manager's amendment, it says, counsel, that the administrator shall limit the amount of people eligible for the program to ensure sufficient funds are available for the 10-year period. Is that correct?
If I could interrupt, I don't think we've mentioned it, but there are also caps on the number of individuals, both first responders
That
and
also.
survivors in the bill. I don't know if the members of
No,
the committee were aware of that.
The
But
point is,
the administrator has no authority under the legislation to affect the amount.
well,
of
and that's
money
one of the
going into
amendments
the
we'll
fund.
offer because, and that'll be for debate. But that we're directing it to NIOSH versus someone who manages health care benefits, which we think probably would be more appropriate. But and we'll end on this, and I'll just point this out. When Medicare was created, this issue of dollars and cents is very, very important, even if the CBO scores it. When Medicaid was created, the House estimated first-year cost was $238 million. Instead, spending hit more than $1 billion that year. So we can say CBO is saying this is enough for the 10-year period, but in all reality, we may bust through this real quickly, and then there's going to have to be. Then we're going to be back here anyway.
If I could,
A second point, and I'll be happy to. Congressional budget folks, when Medicare was established, estimated that it would cost $12 billion in 1990. Its actual 1990 cost was $90 billion, almost a tenfold increase in what the CBO estimated. That is our concern with a couple things. That's the concern of the entitlement. That's the concern about having a cap on the entitlement because we think that's really deceiving that there really is a cap. So
if I could just yield.
Yes.
You want to yield to Mr. Weiner?
I think this is a valuable discussion. If the cap gets broken, as you say, then you get your wish. It becomes a discretionary program because then Congress has to go back and allocate a specific amount of money. And I just want to make it clear, I would kind of dispute that this is mandatory spending in the way you're describing it in the context of Medicare. This is not like that, in that there is a cap that exists. So in a strange way, the best way to look at this is a 10-year discretionary allocation. It's not true mandatory spending like you're used to seeing it because in recognition of that concern, the sponsors and the chairman said, you know what, okay, this is a legitimate beef. Furthermore, it's paid for, and so the notion that it's going to be this out-of-control thing is already addressed in the legislation. So I guess you shouldn't really look at this in mandatory spending like you're used to seeing it. This is, in fact, a 10-year discretionary allocation, and if it is broken, like you say, and by the way, you can't just break this kind of thing. You have to come back to Congress if you want more money. Then it becomes an additional discretionary allocation. Maybe that's a better way to look at it.
And I'll end on this is that when the state children's insurance plan, state of Illinois, in essence, was capped. We busted through the cap. Illinois always comes back to the feds to meet the match. So I really don't believe that there's a cap that's legitimate. I would rather us just fight this battle on regular appropriations. If the argument is just and the cause is right, we can get it, and we do it every year.
Do gentlemen yield with the last 20? I mean, there's a big difference, though, and I don't want to keep belaboring the point, but I mean, when you talk about children, more being born, and every year, and so we can't really calculate. Now, in the case of 9/11, it's very specific of who's eligible. You had to have been there a certain number of days. Now, one could argue as time goes on that perhaps some of the people are going to have more serious illnesses and need more care, which is why it is possible that you would need more funds. But it is a defined population based on the criteria of who was there. So it's not like kids that, you're going to have more and baby boomers and all. Not that I would discourage it, but, it's not exactly the same. The gentleman's time has expired. Would anyone else seek recognition at this time? Okay. Now, again, Mr. Shimkus asked that when we come back that we could have more questions on the manager's amendment, and we will do that. But for now, we're going to recess and reconvene the subcommittee at 1 p.m.